Hey, young scholars, young citizens, Mr. Rand here, and today I'm going to read a short biography about this man. You have maybe seen him around, also known as Andrew Jackson. He is on the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson biography. 7th President of the United States, born March 15th, 1767, died June 8th, 1845. Andrew Jackson's family moved from Ireland in 1765. Andrew was born 2 years later. His father was killed right before he was born in a logging accident, so his mother raised Andrew and his two older brothers in a home of a relative. As a child, Jackson was considered a bully. When he was 13 years old, he joined the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War as a courier, and a courier is someone who delivers important letters or documents. He and his brother were captured by the British. When he once refused to polish the shoes of a British soldier, the officer hit him with a sword and left scars that would remain with him for the rest of his life. There were inwards, unseen scars as a result of the war. He lost his older brother from the war, and his mother also died as a result of cholera or illness. Actually, both brothers were killed from the American Revolutionary War, and his mother died because she was a nurse helping sick American soldiers, and that is where she was infected with cholera. When he was 15 years old, Jackson received an inheritance from his grandfather who lived in Ireland. Being young and inexperienced, he was unable to handle the windfall or the inheritance and spent the entire amount in a week's time. Later, he studied law and became a lawyer at the age of 20. He headed west to Tennessee to seek his fortune. His destination was Nashville, Tennessee, and there he met Rachel Robards. Rachel was married but separated, and she thought her husband had obtained a divorce. Unfortunately, she was mistaken about the finality of the divorce. It took a while, but eventually it was worked out, and Jackson and Rachel were married. In 1796, he served in Congress as a state representative from the state of Tennessee, then again in 1823. In 1805, there was a dispute over a bet on a horse with Mr. Irwin. A pistol duel ensued between Jackson and Mr. Irwin's son-in-law, Charles Dickinson. Some historians say it was also because Dickinson said some really insensitive things about Jackson's wife because technically Rachel was not divorced, and in this time period it was viewed very badly to marry someone who wasn't divorced yet. And so Jackson was going to set the record straight, defend his wife's honor, you might say. It was agreed that Dickinson would shoot his pistol first. His shot hit Jackson and wounded him. In fact, it hit him right in the upper shoulder here. But he didn't die. Jackson didn't die. Jackson's first attempt to fire failed. He took aim again and fired a shot at Dickinson. What happened was, because these were, you can see pictures of them, the pistols right over there, these were flint pistols. And sometimes what happened is the flint would not activate, and the rules of dueling said that, if you fire and your gun doesn't go off, you get another fair shot at the other person. So Jackson then carefully took aim and fired a shot at Dickinson. The man survived for a few hours but died. The duel was the only one of many. So what happened was Jackson, even though he's wounded in the shoulder, he deliberately aimed down low to the belly of Dickinson. And the reason why he did that was because if you were to shoot someone in the belly, that's your intestines, you're going to die. But it was a slow death because they didn't have the surgical procedures to save people. So he was trying to make a point, and that was, if you insult my wife, I'm going to make sure that you're going to die very slowly, bleeding to death. Then, in 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. Andrew Jackson was the commander of the Tennessee militia. Their mission was to defeat the Creek Native American warriors who had sided with the British. At one point, Jackson's soldiers threatened mutiny. He said he would kill them if they left. Previous threats had been carried out, so the mutiny did not occur. In March of 1814, Jackson cornered the Creek Native Americans in Alabama. None of the 1,000 Creek surrendered, and almost all were killed in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The Tallapoosa River ran red with the blood of those who had been slaughtered. Andrew Jackson was known as Old Hickory. He was tough as a hickory stick and had an unbending will. Yet there was a soft side to him. When marching, he preferred to walk with the troops and let the wounded soldiers ride on his horses. The last major battle of the War of 1812 would take place in New Orleans, and Jackson would become famous. Jackson teamed up with the French pirate Jean Lafayette and the Free African Americans of New Orleans. Jackson had about 4,500 men, but was still outnumbered 3-1 by the British. The British thought it was going to be an easy win, but they were surprised when Jackson and his troops stood their ground. The British would lose hundreds of men, but Jackson only lost 8 soldiers and 13 wounded. In fact, the commander of this large British force was killed. His name was Commander Packenham. Was killed in this battle. And another thing is the British soldiers, they were very confident because they just came from Europe. They just defeated Napoleon. These are the best trained soldiers in the world at the time. British Marines and British soldiers. They're battle hardened. They're disciplined, going up against Jackson. And Jackson only had about 1,100, maybe 1,200 American regular soldiers. And the rest of that, to make up the 4,500, these were volunteers. These were freed African Americans. Some of them were frontiersmen that came from Tennessee, and they knew Andrew Jackson. They wanted to help out. And then you had the pirates, right? I mean, so it was a hodgepodge, a mixture of soldiers that were not disciplined, were not battle hardened like these British troops. Jackson, now a celebrity, went back home to Tennessee and with his wife Rachel. They never had children of their own, but adopted one of Rachel's nephews and named him Andrew Jackson Jr. They also adopted a young Creek child, Lincoln, after his parents had been killed by Jackson's troops. Lincoln died at the age of 17 the same year. In 1828, Rachel died. Rachel's life was different than she had thought it would be. She did not know she would spend so much time by herself. She once said her husband spent, quote, less than 1/4 of his time under his own roof. So in other words, he spent a lot of time away from her. During his life, Andrew Jackson became a wealthy man. He owned a plantation, which means a lot of land, with a home he called the Hermitage. In fact, the Hermitage is still around. It's outside of Nashville, and it's open for tourists. It's pretty cool. He grew cotton, which was worked by 100 African slaves. They grew cotton, rice, and tobacco. In the South, more land was needed to grow cotton. The need for land caused issues between the southern states and the Native Americans who occupied the land. Florida was once owned by Spain during this time. In 1817, Jackson invaded Florida in pursuit of Native Americans. He had been instructed by President Monroe not to do so, but Jackson did it anyway. 2 British soldiers were killed. Henry Clay called on Congress to censor Jackson, but they refused. One time, An overseer, that's a plantation boss who oversees enslaved people, killed one of Jackson's enslaved men. Jackson wanted the overseer tried for murder and went to extraordinary lengths to have the event investigated. During this time, killing an enslaved person was illegal by the murderer. Wait, but the murderer was rarely punished, and the death of the enslaved person, if an accident or the result of punishment, was legal. Just back this up. From everything I've learned and read, and historians will say that enslaved people were treated like property because they were someone's property, treated like a car, you might say. They had no legal rights. An enslaved person could not testify in court. If you were a slave owner and you had an enslaved person, you could punch that enslaved person. You could take a baseball bat to that enslaved person. You could do it in front of hundreds of people, and no one would press charges. The enslaved person could not get police and press charges because the enslaved person had zero rights. And so I would have to disagree with this, that about it being illegal to kill a slave. However, if, let's say, I was a slave owner and I loaned out my enslaved person to my neighbor, and while working on my neighbor's plantation, my enslaved person were to die, then my neighbor would have to compensate me for the loss of my property. It's no different than, if your parents loaned a car to someone and they're driving it and they get in a car accident, right? They have to compensate your parents, or the insurance has to compensate your parents for the loss of that piece of property. But during this time period, the enslaved people seriously had zero rights, and you were not viewed as a human being. And we'll talk about this more later on. So, while Jackson never publicly said so, his actions appeared to demonstrate that he was greatly upset by the enslaved man's death. He went beyond what would have been considered normal for those times in trying to get the overseer convicted of murder. And then Jackson was president of the United States, elected president on March 4th, 1829 to March 4th, 1837. Jackson died at the age of 78 from heart failure. Oh, and by the way, after Jackson was sworn in, that's called the inauguration, Jackson had a huge party in Washington, D.C., and he invited thousands of people to the White House. It was so crazy. They said that Jackson, because there were so many people crowded in the White House, he had to actually jump out the window to escape the crowds because they thought they were going to press on him and crush him. And he went across the street from the White House at this time period. There was a little tavern to kind of hide out from all the crowds. And they talk about how there's this huge wheel of cheese. I mean, we're talking like a wheel of cheese, because when they make cheese, they make it in a big wheel. That was like 5 feet round. And they said that it sat out in the front lawn of the White House for like a week, and people would come by and eat cheese off of this. Totally crazy. So anyways, there you go. Andrew Jackson in a nutshell. Thanks and have a great day.